kind of wrapping up the end of the curriculum. We'll be talking about, still talking about nationalism and how that was started with the unification of Germany and Italy. And today we're going to talk about France and the Habsburg Empire. You're going to listen to the video today also about the Habsburg Empire and how it became a dual monarchy. And then we're going to be talking about society this week. We're going to talk about Britain and Ireland, art. Like I said, lots of different things to kind of round out the rest of the 19th century. So today we're going to be talking about Napoleon. So Napoleon III, I should say. So we know from last week that Napoleon III, with the Revolution of 1848, becomes the ruler of France, starts out as president and eventually makes himself emperor. So now we're going to see how exactly does that pan out as Napoleon III makes himself emperor. So, or Louis Napoleon makes himself Napoleon III. So the question is, how was France ruled during the Second Empire? And it was said about Napoleon, it is a great national deal. It is a great deal to be a national glory, a revolutionary guarantee, and a principle of order all at the same time. So Napoleon was trying to do a lot of things, different things at once as leader of France. So he definitely had more of a concern for the working class than his uncle Napoleon Bonaparte did. And he recognized that public opinion was an opportunity to gain support. And he knew that rather than being president, being an emperor, a single leader, allowed him to exert a lot more magnetism than an elected assembly. So he kind of tries to kind of be an emperor, a principle of order, national glory, but at the same time, he tries to rule in somewhat of a more liberal way. And part of his time in office, he's going to be referred to as a liberal emperor. So he kind of tries to do both. He gloried in modern progress, and he wanted to govern equally in the name of all classes. And he felt that government was less important than the economic and social realities for the people. So you know already from last week that he also was big in redesigning Paris and trying to kind of make life better for the people. But so from 1848 or 1852, when he actually makes himself emperor, from 1852 to 1860, he ruled with a more authoritarian empire. And then after 1860, he's going to be more of a liberal emperor. So until 1860, like I said, he had this authoritarian emperor, and his institutions really were modeled on his uncle and the consulate of Napoleon. So he had a council of state that drafted legislation and advised technical matters, and he had an appointed Senate, and that appointed Senate had very few functions. But this legislative body was elected through universal suffrage. So he did not do what other rulers of France did, where you were limited by property. All men, not women, all men could vote. And the government would put up an official candidate for office holders in the district. And basically, like, anyone couldn't decide they wanted to run. The government had to approve you, and you had to be a government-approved candidate. And so the local candidates had no independent powers, so they had to basically consider what was submitted to them by the emperor. They had no control over their budget. The emperor could borrow money as he wished. And the assemblies had no power over the military. So again, this was an authoritarian empire. So with some elements of democracy, but those democratic elements didn't really actually have much actual political power. So you can kind of see some images of Napoleon and his, I don't even know who that's his wife, sorry. So he wanted to glorify the Napoleonic name. He created a very sumptuous court at the Tuileries Palace. The Tuileries Palace doesn't exist anymore in France. It burned down. It was unlike any other at the time. The gardens, by the way, are still there. If you go to Paris, you can visit the gardens, but you can't visit the palace itself. So he marries a young Spanish woman named Eugene. And this was supposed to be a love match, and it helped to popularize the royalty. So think about, like, in Great Britain, like you're too young to know when Princess Diana married Prince Charles, and how that was like this, the modern day fairy tale. Or even think about like Kate Middleton and Prince William. and kind of like popularized the monarchy, having this, young, beautiful princess. Paris, like I said before, is redesigned while Napoleon is ruling, through those wide boulevards, public squares, and vistas, with monuments at the end. This was done to stimulate business and employment, eliminating the crooked and narrow streets, giving more air and light into the city, which actually makes it more healthy to live there. But it also allows for the fast movement of troops against insurrections and the prevention of erecting barricades, because we know that the French love nothing more than to riot and build barricades blocking the streets. Now, after 1860, he has what's referred to as the Liberal Empire, in which he kind of eases back on some of the authoritarian aspects of his empire. He allows moderates into the legislature to reform a ministry. He agreed to a more liberal constitution. And the ministers are like advisors to the emperor. They're responsible to the legislature. And liberal concessions were made to regain support after problems with foreign policy, in particular Italy. So, how did the French economy improve under Napoleon III? So Napoleon III wanted to be known as a great social engineer. He invented investment banking to guide financial resources. So, people make investments in different businesses, and that, help kind of raise money for businesses to borrow money, which allows the business to grow. And then you make a profit, or you gain interest if that company makes a profit. So he kind of invented investment banking. A discovery of gold in places like California and Australia brought new money into the world supply. So we see a steady rise of prices that go along with that. And that encouraged, though, the promotion of new companies and investment of capital. Railways were growing very quickly during this time in France. So there was lots of mines being opened up and factories being built. The railways helped all of that. We also see large corporations begin to grow in France. So in 1863, we have the law of limited liability being passed, which encouraged investors of smaller means to experiment and to diversify their portfolios, invest in different companies. The emperor also did want to do some things for the working class. Like I said, he kind of tried to be a champion of all. So he did do humanitarian relief, building things like hospitals, distributing free medicine. In 1864, it became legal for unions to go on strike. So there were large labor unions were then legalized in France, and he did believe in free trade. And in 1860, actually made a free trade treaty with Great Britain. So here we can see, this is some images. I think this was actually in that video. This is what Paris looked like prior to it being rebuilt. These really tiny, narrow, crooked streets. And then we see this well laid out city as a result. That's some views of Paris more recently. That's the Champs-Élysées, which is one of those main long boulevards you could see with these broad vistas going down. That's just the craziness of the traffic circle around the Arc de Triomphe. But this also kind of shows you a little bit of Napoleon III, who ruled from 1852 to 1870. 1852 was emperor, came to power in 1848. But in foreign policy, he gets involved in the Crimean War, which actually was a victory, but then had some issues with Italy. As far as colonial policy, he extends the empire in trying to kind of like force open China. He strangely overthrows the Mexican government and tried to turn it into a satellite state. We talked about that in AP World in regards to the Mexican Revolution. And so he had a lot of different economic ideas to try to revitalize, the economy of France. So how, though, despite all of these kind of positive things, was the empire having problems? So his policies of free trade made him enemies with some of the industrialists who would have favored tariffs, which would have protected their industries. Many Catholics objected to his intervention in Italy, siding with Piedmont, Sardinia, against the views of the Pope. Ultimately, he's going to ruin himself by war. And he loses the empire on the battlefield because in 1852, when he became emperor, he assured the people that his empire is going to mean peace. But war is the supreme example of pageantry. France was a very powerful country at this point, and they had a name to live up to. Ultimately, what's going to bring an end to this empire is in 1870, he's going to be captured by the Prussians. He's going to be imprisoned, and he's going to flee to England, where he's going to die in 1873. And so his time in power is going to come to an end with the Franco-Prussian War. And after the Franco-Prussian War and he was kind of overthrown, Paris tries to declare itself a new republic on its own. It's, in some ways, Paris tries to kind of break away. And so here you could see Napoleon III and William I bathing in the blood of their people. That's his tomb. But so I had just said that Paris basically tries to declare itself its own its own independent state. So why did the Paris Commune declare its independence? So in September of 1870, after France's defeat, Napoleon III abdicates the throne and a new government is created. This new government continued the fight against the Germans who had laid siege to Paris. So Paris is being surrounded by German troops, or Prussian troops. To defend Paris, a National Guard was raised, numbering over 350,000. And France surrendered in February of 1871 after 40,000 Parisians died. So executive power was given to this man, Adolphe Thiers, and he's the one who negotiates a peace treaty with Germany. But many Parisians who had suffered very brutally during this siege, with so many people dying, felt that making a treaty with the Germans, or the Prussians, I should say, was a betrayal. So that's why in March of 1871, the Parisians are going to elect a new municipal government that's going to be known as the Paris Commune, and essentially is going to try to break away from France. So this government that was tried to be created under Adolphe Thiers was seen as too conservative, too royalist, and again, too willing to accept this peace treaty with Prussia. Now remember, just to kind of go full circle, this war and the way that the French were left after this war creates a lot of bad blood between France and Germany leading up to World War I, which is not that far in the future at this point. It's only about 40 years in the future. 45 years, and leads to a lot of the bad blood in the Treaty of Versailles. But Prussian troops marched into Paris in March of 1871, and the French government established itself at Versailles, not Paris. And this was also something that angered the Parisians because they felt that Paris was the capital of France. They opposed these new policies of this government, and they attempted to restore order in Paris by basically revolting, and they created their own government. So the Paris Commune, or the Communards, was elected on March 28th and established itself at the Hotel de Ville, not a hotel, basically a city hall. And so here you could see some of the fighting during the siege. And so again, built barricades, because even though there's wider streets, the Parisians still figure out how to build barricades. That's the Hotel de Ville. That's basically Paris City Hall, which is essentially going to get destroyed during the fighting. Now, what are some of the reforms that the Communards tried to create in this government? So they allowed trade unions and worker cooperatives to take over the factories not in use and start them up again. They set up unemployment exchanges in the various different town halls. So Paris, each different district of Paris, I believe, has its own separate town hall. They were going to provide basic elementary education for all. And they were strongly against the church-controlled schools, which were the dominant way of education in France at the time. And they attempted to set up schools particularly for girls. And they also set up nurseries near factories for working mothers. So a lot of this is very similar to what we're going to see later in like the social welfare reforms post-World War II. But they didn't really have a lot of time to accomplish everything. A lot of this came into fruition because the Paris Commune does not last very long. But it serves as an inspiration to later revolutionaries. In fact, some people felt that this might have been like the first communist revolution. 25,000 were killed and 35,000 were arrested in the fighting after, trying to create this separate Parisian state. And here you can see some of the casualties, some of the fighting. and the general aftermath when it was all put down. So, the Third Republic. So the Third Republic, after the Commune is destroyed, the Third Republic comes in, new government set up in France. So here we can see the declaration of the Third Republic. So an overview of the Third Republic. It's, again, politically very unstable. We're really not going to see a stable government come to France until we see the Fifth Republic, which is the republic that comes to power after World War II, which is the republic that is still currently in power in France. There's a lot of rivalry between the monarchists and the republicans, which is this trend we've been seeing throughout France's history since the revolution. There were a number of scandals. We'll talk at another time about the Dreyfus affair, because that was a pretty significant scandal that kind of affected a lot of things later. But there were so many factions, and basically you had to see that all governments were coalitions, meaning one political party was not able to gain a large enough majority that they could govern, so they would have to build these coalitions. But it survived longer than any other regime since 1789, so we'll give it a win for that. It goes all the way up, I believe. It falls after World War I. So in this situation, the president is the head of state but has little political power. He has the right to dissolve the Chamber of Deputies with the support of the Senate. Also has the right to nominate a new head of government and played an important role in foreign affairs. Then you have the Senate. The Senate is elected by the mayors and the councilors in the counties throughout France, and it was nicknamed the Chamber of Agriculture because the countryside was overrepresented. The senators were elected every 9 years, and it was very conservative and managed to block a lot of progressive legislation. Then you had the Chamber of Deputies, which was chosen every 4 years. 600 members were elected by universal male suffrage, but there was no organized party system. So the major political groupings we see are your socialists, your moderate Republicans, your radicals, and your monarchists. So you have a wide range of different political views. So basically, the political structure, despite all of this, like I said, was rather strong. It managed to survive a lot of challenges for leaderships. It managed to survive several scandals, like I pointed out before. Now, during this Third Republic, we have the 1889 Paris Exposition, which was a world fair. And this was actually when the Eiffel Tower was completed, and it was supposed to be the entranceway into the fairgrounds. It was actually supposed to be a temporary structure. It was supposed to be taken down later. And a lot of the Parisians did not particularly care for it, even though today it is basically synonymous with Paris. There you can see the Eiffel Tower today. That's if you're standing at the bottom and you're looking up into the tower. That's what you see. That's me and my friend Joanne. And that's some of the elevators going up to the top. So that was the line to get into the Eiffel Tower. As we were already up there, we got there very early, but you can kind of see the line sneaking around as all these tourists are waiting to go see the Eiffel Tower. And then that's the Eiffel Tower at night. That's me and my friend Joanne again. And that's, you can see, kind of looking up into the bottom. But so we see also London also had a similar great exposition in the late 19th century, and they built something called the Crystal Palace, which was the largest glass and steel structure ever built. So they would have these, we had the World's Fair, if you think in Queens by City Field. There's the grounds for when the World's Fair was in the United States. I believe it was the 1960s. So, who do you think you would rather have lived under? Napoleon III or Napoleon I?